very happy to be live with our crime and graphic novel panel. I'm going to allow it to introduce themselves and tell us a bit about their books, starting with David, because you're in the middle.
Okay. Hello, yes, my name's David Bishop, and as DV Bishop, I write a series of historical thrillers set in Renaissance Florence, of which the second book in the series is The Darkest Sin, which is lurking over my shoulder here. And before I started writing crime novels, I was a comics editor for 12 years, and I've been writing comics and graphic novels for 30 years as well.
Fabulous. Anthony?
Yeah, I'm Antony Johnston. I'm a New York Times bestselling writer of books, graphic novels, video games, film, short stories, non-fiction, lots of different stuff. I'm best known for Atomic Blonde, the Cold War spy movie starring Charlize Theron, which was based on my graphic novel. But I also write the Brigitte Sharp books, which is a series of modern day spy thrillers, the latest of which, the Patriot Network, is out now. I write video games like Dead Space and The Assembly, and most recently Resident Evil Village, which is the one with the giant 9-foot-tall vampire lady, which you may have seen around on the internet. If you haven't, don't worry about it. And I also write non-fiction. My book, The Organized Writer, is a productivity guide explaining how I do all these different things and write all this stuff while keeping on top of my deadlines. But like David, I've been writing comics for 20 years. Still going strong along with all the other stuff that I do.
Fantastic. So I'm giddy with excitement about this panel because I love comics, and I've been dying to get like a panel on where we talk about them for a while. So can you start us off with telling us a little bit about like what you think it makes kind of graphic novels so appealing to people? Why are they particularly good for things like crime and espionage and things like that? What do you think?
Anthony, you go.
Oh, I was going to say, David, you go. You're the former editor. You know what you're looking for. I think it's mostly visual, obviously. If you're doing action stuff, it is much, much simpler to get that across to an audience in a visual manner. One of the most difficult things that I do writing these spy thrillers is action scenes and making them understandable and visual and visceral so that the reader understands what's going on but is also excited by them. It's so much easier to do that when you can just draw pictures or, in the case of movies, obviously show real people moving. So I think that's a large part of it. But also, I mean, the graphic novel that Atomic Blonde's based on is not actually all sort of kicking and punching and everything like the film. It's actually a very staid, John le Carré-esque Cold War, noirish story, not a sort of action thriller at all. But again, the reason that I did it in that medium and the reason that it worked in the graphic novel medium is because you can get that atmosphere across without needing to explain it, without needing to be blatantly sort of like hammering people over the head and going, this is a noir story. You can just show it. You just the look of it and the feel of it and the visual atmosphere is enough to get that across to the audience. And that's where graphic novels are one of the places where graphic novels really shine.
What about you?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that was just said, actually. The ability to visualize everything is one of the strengths, and the ability just through a simple picture to create the atmosphere, and also because you have color, you have lighting, all the other effects that are available to you. And one of the things I love about comics and graphic novels as a medium is it's halfway in some extents between prose and screenwriting. So with screenwriting, one of the requirements is, largely speaking, you have to externalize the internal. So whatever a character is feeling in film, you have to find ways of making that visually evident to the audience, unless you're going to go for voiceover or flashback as a sort of storytelling crutch when done badly. But the joys of comics and graphic novels is that you can have things like first-person narration, you can have dramatic monologue through caption boxes. So we can read the story visually, but we can also find out what's going on inside a character's head as they creep through a building, or while they're trying to deduce what's going on. So there are ways that you could use the best of both mediums, the ability to dig into the heads of the characters, what they're thinking and feeling, and at the same time the great visual storytelling, the shortcuts that it enables you to do. And I think comics and graphic novels as well, it's the level of concision, because we're able to see as well as read, that you can tell much more compressed stories, or stories in a much more compressed space than would do otherwise, which is why I think comics and graphic novels adapt so well to film, much like short stories adapt well to film, whereas you try and take an entire novel and turn it into a film, and usually there's a lot of sacrifices to be made, just because the density of storytelling is problematic in screen form sometimes.
One of the other things as well, and you kind of touched on it a little there, one of the other things that comics does, or you can do in comics really well, is contradict and contrast the words and the visuals. Actually, one of the best known examples of this, or proponents of this, is Ed Brubaker, who writes crime graphic novels mostly, and quite often his captions or his voiceover, as it's done in comic style, will completely contradict or undermine or undercut whatever's being shown in the visuals. And that's something that, again, you just kind of can't do in prose, but you can do in this visual medium, because you have both the words and the images.
Good answers. We've got some hellos. We've got some hellos from Donna, Laura, and Mills Pixie. Sam has also said hello, and she's asked us, do we all have a favourite graphic novel that we revisit?
Golly.
Me included, so I'm not escaping this question, apparently.
Well, why don't you answer first then?
I don't know if I have an answer. I love kind of crime and horror and things like that, but I have to admit the graphic novels I revisit really often, and it's very embarrassing, things like the manga retellings of Jane Austen.
Nothing wrong with that.
So nice to read.
I did a graphic novel called Julius that was an adaptation of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, but done with gangsters in the East End.
Ooh.
So yeah, nothing wrong with the manga Jane Austen's at all. It's a really tricky question, this, because there are so many. There's the obvious ones, aren't there? I mean, and David knows, that we all know the milieu. There's Watchmen, and there's V for Vendetta, and there's Invisibles, and there's Preacher, and they're all kind of the obvious answers to that question. I wonder if there's something less obvious that we could maybe recommend to people.
It's a good question. You have to excuse me. I'm coming down with my first cold in 4 years of a non-COVID related variety.
Oh,
so
no.
I'm sucking on a load of all soothers. So if I make a load of slurping noises, that's why. To stop my throat completely drying up on me. There's a lot of very obvious answers, and I'm not going to contradict any of those because they're all classics for a reason. I think probably something like Daredevil Born Again, by Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli, although it's quite well known. That because it focuses on Daredevil, and it's not so much Daredevil in costume, he's just a guy for most of the story, and he's up against Kingpin, and anybody who's watched the Daredevil TV series will know what we're talking about. And then I think almost all of the Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips projects that they've collaborated on together. There's a whole series they're doing under the banner name of Reckless, and there's some amazing crime stories that they're telling in there, and as a creative partnership they're doing some incredible work, those two. So if anybody's looking for a crime graphic novel, I would start with Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips as a combination. You really can't go wrong with those two creators.
I completely agree. I was actually, if you hadn't mentioned them, I think I was going to say Ed and Sean's stuff as well. Ed Brubaker really is kind of the preeminent crime writer working in comics, I would say. Partly just because of his consistency of material. Him and Sean have put out so much work, and it's all such incredibly high quality that, yeah, you really can't go wrong with that series. And they're all, the Reckless stuff that David mentioned is all kind of loosely related. It shares a world, but you can pick up any of those graphic novels and read it without needing to have read any of the other related graphic novels, you might get a little bit more out of it because you might see recurring characters, but the stories themselves are all written to stand alone, and so you really can't go wrong with those. No.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I spent 10 years, 12 years, I think, working on Judge Dredd in 2000 AD, which is sort of great British comics. Um, and out of all the Dreads, people tend to forget that sort of Dredd mostly gets, for those who don't know, he's a policeman of the future. And mostly sort of it's the politics and the sort of fascist elements of Dredd and a police state and a surveillance state is where a lot of people's focus tends to go on with Dredd. And he has supernatural enemies as well. But actually, one of my favorite Dredd series is called The Pit. And essentially, it's Judge Dredd does Hill Street Blues. So Dredd, who's normally sort of roving the city, instead he's assigned to a single precinct house, sector house in the city, and he has to deal with a lot of corruption amongst the police, the judges there. So that's one of my favorites by a great naturalized, I guess, British writer, who, although he's from Pennsylvania originally, John Wagner, who also co-created the graphic novel The History of Violence, which was turned into a very, very good David Cronenberg film. And actually, if I'm thinking about crime graphic novels, I think I'd have to suggest Road to Perdition by Max Allan Collins and Richard Piers Rayner, which was also turned into an amazing film by Sam Mendes with Tom Hanks and Paul Newman and Daniel Craig. And it's just a stunning film to see. And it's very closely based on the source material, the original graphic novel.
There's one other series that actually I've just realized I do reread fairly regularly, and I'm slightly biased. I have to kind of declare my interests here, because it's written by Greg Rucka, who people watching this may know from his crime and thriller novels. He wrote a very successful series, the Atticus Kodiak series, that was mostly published in America, although there are British editions as well, in the 2000s. But then he also wrote a comic series called Queen and Country, which is a spy thriller series about the British SIS. And the interest is that Greg is an old friend of mine in the business, and I wrote an arc of one of the Queen and Country spin-offs. So slight bias, but nevertheless, part of the reason that I was so honored to write that story arc was because I'm a huge fan of the series, and it is one that stands up to repeated rereading as well. If anybody watching is familiar with an old 70s British TV show called The Sandbaggers, Queen and Country is very much a spiritual successor to The Sandbaggers. It's all about the intrigue in the corridors of power in Westminster and the sort of dirty side of spying and foreign interventions that the British government undertakes. It's an excellent series.
Yes, and actually now you've said that, that's made me think of another one I reread, which is Whiteout, also by Greg Rucka and drawn by Steve Lieber, which is, I think, maybe his first comics work, and that's essentially a murder mystery that takes place in the Antarctic, which was turned into a regrettably not quite so successful film version. So avoid the film because it's the original graphic novel of Whiteout.
Absolutely, the graphic novel is great. The film, not so much.
I'm making mental notes of these as we go. The ones I haven't read, I'm slashing away the ones to go and buy after we've finished talking. Before I ask you any more of the questions on there, what I want to know, because I often ask in our author chats if people would think of adapting their books into graphic novels. Now, obviously, you've done that. What do you think helps you from going from that sort of medium into writing like you do now? What's helped you translate into writing kind of prose novels? What have you taken from that kind of graphic novel background to make your writing better, if that makes sense?
Go on, David, you go for this one.
Well, I think writing for comics forces you to think into clarity, because you have to tell the story to the artist who's going to be doing it. So you have to write a script that's going to tell the story to the artist. And at the same time, you have to think about the ultimate reader of the comic version. So you're writing for two audiences at the same time. But so clarity is crucially important. I think you have to make characterization absolutely at the forefront of your thinking with comics. And, and then the third thing I think is concision, the ability to boil the essence of the story down and then separate out the visual elements and what you want to be represented. as text, either through dialogue or what you're going to turn into caption boxes or dramatic monologues, or the equivalent of voiceover, I guess we would call it. So there's a lot of, I certainly think, having worked in comics, it's made my prose writing a lot pacier. I mean, I write historical thrillers, and historical crime fiction can sometimes have a reputation of being a little bit languid and slightly wallowing in the research and the period. And the biggest note I tend to get from my editor at Pan Macmillan is, okay, no shortage of pace. Could we maybe just slow down occasionally? Because having written comics for 30 years, my tendency is to want to put the foot to the floor. So I'm always conscious of get into the scene as late as possible, get out of the scene as soon as possible. And actually with prose, you need to wallow a little bit more, have those bead of sweat moments where we linger. And you can do those in comics, but you can do those so briskly by comparison. So yeah, there's sort of strengths to bring from one to the other. Weirdly, I've done it the other way around. So I've written a load of tie-in books based on licensed properties. So a lot of them I've written tie-in books based on Doctor Who, but I've also written Judge Dredd novels where you create an original story featuring Judge Dredd, who's this future cop comics character. And it's quite odd going the other way, because you have to flesh out things that the comics writers have never had to think about before. So the joy of comics is not that you can go once over lightly, but you can do a lot of the storytelling is visual, so it saves you a lot of time. So there's a lot of shorthand available to you, I would suggest. Yeah.
I agree 100% with all of that. I have exactly the same experience with people saying, like, this is really pacey. And I'm like, is it? Are you sure? And they're like, yeah, trust me. But also, like David, I come at this from both angles. My first published fiction was actually a novella. It wasn't a comic book or a graphic novel. That was a supernatural thriller called Frightening Curves, which won an award at Book Expo America, which set me up with incredibly unrealistic expectations of future award ceremonies. And I kept my hand in even while I was writing graphic novels. So I also wrote then a novel for Abaddon, which is owned by Rebellion, who published 2000 AD. And that was a sci-fi fantasy book, but also a crime caper. It was about a thief and a heist that goes wrong, and the thief has to go on the run. So I've always kind of had, my foot in both camps, much like David writing the tie-in fiction. And then I also go in the other direction because I adapt Anthony Horowitz's Alex Rider teen spy books to graphic novels. So I write the scripts for those graphic novels. And that, of course, is taking, as you say, what is a much more kind of, or something that can afford to be a little more languid, although actually the Alex Rider books are very, very fast paced, but nevertheless less fast paced than a graphic novel. And I have to take those and boil them down to the pace of a graphic novel, which is a constant challenge, especially with the later books, as they seem to get longer with every installment. So that's a fascinating thing to do as well, kind of take a graphic novel's approach to a story that's being told in prose. But yeah, as I say, I agree entirely with David about the skills you can move from one to the other, and the need to sometimes go, oh, hang on, it's okay, I can slow down a bit. Novel readers will be okay with things moving a teensy bit slower rather than at 3,000 miles an hour.
Donna has asked if you're visual writers. Can you picture what you want to write? She's especially interested as you've worked in a visual medium.
I am entirely, yeah. I always, not to a level of detail necessarily. I don't think about sort of, actual faces. I'm certainly not somebody who pictures, movie stars in my character roles or something, but I do absolutely picture the situations and kind of mentally map out the geography of locations and scenes for sure.
Yeah, I do as well. I'm completely. I see the movie in my head when I'm writing it, whether it's for comics or for prose. It's spooling away in my head. And actually, I write for a comic book character called the Phantom, who's the Ghost Who Walks, he's been around longer than Superman. He dates back to the mid 1930s, I think. So he started as a newspaper strip adventure character in Africa, and he goes around. He wears a costume which I honestly don't think how that is meant to make them blend into the jungle, but whatever.
Isn't he the one in the purple skin tight? Yeah.
With often with striped pants worn on the outside. Surely this makes you a target. But anyway, and so I just wrote my 48th issue for the Phantom. It's published in Sweden in Swedish territories by Egmont, and it's reprinted in English in Australia by an Australian publisher. But it's almost never published in the UK, so nobody ever sees it, which is quite freeing in a way. But when I was writing my latest issue of that, and they've cut the page count down to 22 pages for a complete story, which is a bit of a push, it has to be said. But the joy of comics is that you can sometimes just have a caption box that says 3 hours later, and literally you can jump everything that's happened in the 3 hours in between. You just go, okay, they're doing a thing, and then you can just go to soon or later or the next day, and we just jump straight over it without any explanation. And the readers of comics and graphic novels are so used to the fact that you can do this, that you can have these vast jumps backwards and forwards in time and space. They don't bat an eyelid, whereas I find with prose readers, not that they need their hand held a little bit more, they're just not used to such abrupt shifts, whereas in comics, it's commonplace.
So when you're writing a fight scene or a sort of action point in your thrillers, so I'm thinking, because you both write thrillers, do you act them out as you're writing them? Do you see them visually? We often ask our authors if they act out a scene as they write it, but I'm imagining if you're seeing them very visually, do you just see it there? Do you like to act things out?
I definitely don't. No. Yeah, I do see it. As I say, I picture it, and I try to look at it as a cameraman might if it was a film, or as an artist might if it was a graphic novel. But I use that to then describe what I'm saying. I don't rely on actually, getting up and moving around. That seems like far too much effort.
Yes, writers, we're a very sedentary type. There's not a lot of action happening. The occasional chair rolling back to go and fetch another coffee is about the limit for me. But it is, I find with comics, it's more a case of trying to figure out, because I have to be able to describe it to the artist, and therefore it's trying to come up with a prose way of describing an action sequence that an artist can understand and then hopefully bring to life on the page. And the joy of working with a great artist is they will make you look better as a writer, because they will take what you've written and they will improve upon it on the page. So that's always a joy. I think for prose, because most of the certainly the historical thrillers I write, they're always seen through the eyes of particular characters. I mean, they have different viewpoints, but they're seen through the eyes of characters. So I try and write the character's experience of what it's like to be in this situation, and what they're thinking, their mind is racing, what they're feeling, what their emotional state is, and what their physical state is at the same time, but as if they're experiencing it in the moment. So it's trying to bring that to life on the page. So I don't have to worry too much about pulling the camera back and then showing all the choreography of where everybody is simultaneously. It's more the point of view of one character trying to figure out, how am I getting out of this alive? And how do I feel about this? Am I terrified? Am I excited? Am I, irked? Whatever the case may be.
And an important part of that, actually, and I'm sure David finds the same thing, an important part of writing action scenes from a point of view, especially in thrillers, is that it's more about sensation rather than exact, precise mechanics of somebody's hand moving in a certain direction, or the position of somebody's feet, when that sort of thing. Readers, in my experience, and certainly myself as a reader, just don't care about that as much. What they care about, as David said, is how does it feel for that character? What are, again, the sensations that character is feeling, whether there's a psychological, physical. I think that's much more important, and that's the sort of thing that you can't really get acting out, which is one of the reasons I don't do it, apart from just I would feel quite silly even by myself here in my study. It's not as necessary, because, like I say, for me anyway, certainly, but as both a writer and a reader, it's much more about the effect it has on somebody's emotions and psyche and approach to a scene, rather than the literal mechanics of how somebody's moving through space.
You would be surprised at the bunch of authors we have in our group's answers to that question. Then there's some very entertaining people in our group who very much act things out or try things out.
The thing is, I used to do karate when I was younger, and I have also been an actor on stage, but I've never felt the need to do it when I'm writing a story.
Yes, I think in comics, the people that will be doing that will be the artists, because they're the ones who are going to need sort of visual reference of what somebody looks like, you know, the dramatic foreshortening of having the fist and the person in focus at the same time, and all these sorts of things. So if you go on artists' Twitters or their Insta streams, you'll find lots of them will post the latest reference photos of them with a gun doing things, which I just find hilarious. And they'll show the pose and then the image that they've drawn from that.
Or you get the late and great Steve Dillon, whose characters all were basically idealized versions of Steve. They just all look like Steve with 20 pounds shaved off, you know.
Yes, Steve Dillon also, who used to draw a lot of the pages of Preacher while he was in the pub, in between playing pool. He was a demon on the pool table, but then once he eventually got knocked out of the pool table, he would put his 50p on the table to go back on next time he was on. And then he'd draw a page of Preacher sat at the table in between pints, which is quite a level of skill, I have to say.
He was an amazing talent, yeah.
What a job, though, as well. If you can just be doing it like in between points. That's amazing. What has been people's reception to you? Because obviously you'll have had readers from both aspects of what you've done. You'll have got readers that follow you for your historical thrillers and follow you for your like novels, and for your graphic novels. Do they cross over? What's the reception to like what you're writing now like?
I mean, I don't find that largely, but then it's sort of, they're quite separate worlds. So I haven't thus far discovered a lot of crossover from one to the other. But Anthony's experience may be very different.
Not very different. There's a little crossover. Partly because I've done a lot of the same genres, because I've done crime and spy thriller graphic novels. And so doing crime and spy thriller books, you know, there's kind of, at least genre-wise, there is a crossover of audience. But yeah, they are very different worlds, as David says. And not to say that people who read graphic novels don't also read novels, or vice versa, but they won't necessarily always gravitate towards the same kind of graphic novels or novels, the same genre across media. So there are definitely, I know there are some graphic novel readers of mine who also read the Brigitte books, but yeah, but it's by no means a one-to-one correlation at all.
Yeah, no, I don't. There isn't a lot. I mean, even there are a lot of people who write tie-in novels and original novels, and the amount, you know, you could write a New York Times bestseller because you've written a Star Wars novel, for instance, but the number of people that will go from that and then go and read the same writer's original novel is vanishingly small, unfortunately. So it's, yeah, there's not as much crossover as you might hope.
Tell me about it. One of my NYT bestsellers was the Daredevil Season 1 graphic novel. If everybody who bought that bought like my latest spy thriller, I would be a very happy man indeed, but that's not the case.
No.
I always thought it would work that you would find, so I love Wonder Woman graphic novels, big fan, but the really old ones, like the really terrible eras, like the I Ching era is one of my favorites because they're so bad. And I found a tie-in novel of those written by an author and then went and bought all of their books because I really enjoyed the novel. So I always thought it would work the other way around, that people would find maybe Atomic Blonde and then go, oh, this is amazing, and then go and find all of your prose.
Yeah, that may have happened to an extent, but yeah, certainly, again, if everybody who had bought Atomic Blonde as a result of seeing the movie, bought my latest thriller novel, I would be very, very happy man indeed.
You've been asked what you feel about visual Oh, hang on, let me read the question properly. You've been asked, are you a fan of comic spin-offs that make it to the small or big screen? Well, you've had one adapted, Anthony. Sam was thinking how much you enjoy Smallville, although this was some time ago.
I never watched Smallville, actually, I'm afraid.
But are you a fan of comic spin-offs that make it to the small or big screen?
I mean, I'm a fan of adaptations for sure. I think some of them are great, some of them not so great. But there are, and the thing is, there are a lot of films which people don't even realize are based on comics and graphic novels. Men in Black, for example, most people have no idea that that's based on a series of indie comic books from the 90s, I think, 80s or 90s. The film The Losers, which was based on a DC comic series written by David's assistant editor, I believe, when he was editing 2000 AD, mutual friend Andy Diggle. Again, most people have no idea that it's based on a comic book. Anything that isn't superheroes, a lot of people don't realize it's based on comic books. A History of Violence, which David mentioned earlier, and Road to Perdition, both of those. History of Violence, I believe Tom Hanks never even read the graphic novel. He's on record as like he never read it. Sorry, that's Road to Perdition, sorry, isn't it? Not History of Violence. But yeah, he's on record as having never read the graphic novel, even though the film is a relatively faithful adaptation. But yeah, a lot of people just have no idea how many films are actually based on them.
Yeah, I mean, we're if not in the golden age, we're certainly in the gold rush when it comes to the amount of comics that are currently being adapted into film and TV series, and some fairly obscure choices that you might not have expected. I mean, I gotta say, I did not have on my bingo card that somebody would be doing the Werewolf by Night TV series, which seems very topical, it being Halloween this weekend, effectively. And I sort of thought, of all the comics that somebody might adapt into a TV series, I wouldn't have picked Werewolf by Night by quite a long chalk, and yet it's now currently available to view. And it does. I mean, I watched quite a few of these. So I was watching the She-Hulk TV series, and the final episode of that, for anybody who hasn't seen it, goes complete metafiction. And I won't tell you any more than that. You haven't seen it in case it spoils it for you. And there was a lot of sort of quite angry people online complaining about this. And I was like, have you not read the source material that this was based on? The whole early run of She-Hulk by John Byrne is just, she's constantly turning around and talking to the reader, and it breaks the fourth wall all the time, which they do in a TV show. So it's absolutely in keeping with the style of the comics, the particular run that it's based on. So yeah, no, it's strange. Some people, I think, they get upset about things just because it's not what they want it to be, their version of it in their head. But I think that's true of almost any adaptation, that you go, well, it's not the same as the book I originally read. And it's like, well, yes, because if it was an absolutely, completely faithful translation, you're not going to be making best use of the strengths of the medium you're shifting into. I think you have to adapt properly. It can't just be a transposition. It needs to, transcend into the new medium that you're going to and use the strengths of that medium. Otherwise, why are you bothering?
I couldn't agree with that more. And I mean, Atomic Blonde is a case in point, because like I say, the graphic novel is very much a sort of noirish, John le Carré, not full of action and what have you. And it's black and white. It's literally black and white, noir. And then, of course, the film is bright 80s neon and, kicking and punching everywhere. But if you had tried to faithfully adapt the graphic novel to the screen, it would have been boring. Even I wouldn't have wanted to watch that, what works, as David says, in one medium is not necessarily going to work in another, and you have to adapt to the strengths of a medium, and the strength of cinema is movement. That's literally what it's about. We call them the movies for a reason. They are moving pictures. And so, yeah, part of the reason, I won't go too far down the Atomic Blonde rabbit hole, but part of the reason that we were excited when Dave, the director, came up with his vision for the film was because we realized it was something new that took advantage of the medium, but kept the essence of the graphic novel, the story, the plot, the characters. Those are all largely the same. It's just told in a very, very different style that is much more suitable to the film medium. And I think as long as any adaptation does that, whether it's TV, film, or book to graphic novel, as I do with the Alex Rider books, as long as you're keeping that essence and you're using the advantages and the unique techniques that the format you're writing in allows you to, then yeah, I think, you know, you'll always have success if you do that.
Yeah, it's the film version of Watchmen, which is probably one of the most celebrated graphic novels of the past 40 years. And it's remarkably faithful for large chunks of the film, like whole swathes of dialogue lifted wholesale onto the page. And yet it kind of suffers for me personally from the fact that they don't play a bit more fast and loose. They don't play more to the strengths of where they're going to. Although I do still miss the psychic space squid, which didn't make it to the film version. But that's just me.
I think it's telling that one of the things that a lot of people enjoy the most about Watchmen is the opening montage, where we get the history told in a sort of, you know, montage time lapse fashion. That's brilliant. And that's the bit that is furthest away from the comic, furthest removed from the graphic novel, and uses cinematic techniques. And that's the bit that most people agree is the best part of the film. So I think that's quite telling.
Yeah. Isn't Alan Moore very much like Stephen King in the camp of people who really hate the adaptations of their work?
Yes, but for very different reasons than Stephen King.
Yeah, no, I'm sure they are very different reasons. They're both like two people who are dramatically on record as tending to hate adaptations of their work.
Yeah, I mean, in Stephen King's case, I know he's not a fan of some of the adaptations that have been done of his work, and has even made his own adaptations in some cases to sort of redress the balance of whatever was done, for better or for worse. Whereas Alan Moore's case, Alan Moore's argument is mostly to do with the fact of contractual and having his rights, having signed away his rights, and then the exploitation of that by corporations. So his beef, I think, is largely to do with corporations and how his creativity has been taken and treated and mistreated in some cases. So I think they come at it from slightly different angles. Stephen King, I think, has got a lot more power over what does and doesn't happen to his work now than Alan Moore does, certainly.
But also, Stephen doesn't have a principal objection to adaptations. He's just disappointed that most of them are not very good.
Yeah. His is more at a quality control. Alan Moore, I think, is at a contractual level, because Alan refuses to watch any of them anyway. So and stays as far away from them as humanly possible, or as we like to call it, Northampton.
Hey.
Well, we're on the adaptations. If someone was going to adapt The Darkest Sin or The Patriots Network, how involved would you want to be? I mean, you've already been there, haven't you, with the adaptations, Anthony? But how involved would you like to be if it was your prose?
Yeah, I was a co-producer on Atomic Blonde. We actually, the first book in the Brigitte Sharp series, The Exphoria Code, has been optioned for TV. It's in development with Red Planet, the people who make Hustle and Death in Paradise and shows like that. And yes, if that goes forward, I will be involved to some level. I won't necessarily be writing scripts, but I will be involved. And at the moment, that's a level of involvement I'm comfortable with. You know, I wouldn't object to writing scripts for them. I have written screenplays and stuff, but to be perfectly frank, I have enough other stuff going on at the moment that I don't really have the time to spend a year writing a TV version of a story that I've already written. So yeah, I'm quite prepared to leave that in the hands of the showrunner, but I would absolutely be involved and, you know, helping sort of bring the vision to the screen.
Yeah, I expect, sadly, the Cesare Aldo series will never be turned into films or television, simply because historical settings, it adds a minimum of 25% to the budget before you've even, turned a camera over. So I doubt it will ever occur. If it did, I don't know. It's whether you go for the sort of, I'll just take the money and run and you can do what you like with it attitude, which I know some authors absolutely do. They just say, send the check, that's fine. as far as I'm concerned, it's your own thing. You do with it what you want. My book is still on the shelf. You can't destroy my book. The book still exists in its original form. Or whether I'd want to be a bit more involved, I don't. I think I would cross that bridge when I got to it. I mean, I have written for TV. I wrote for Doctors on BBC One and a couple of other shows, and I've written radio dramas as well. So I've done screenwriting in the past, much like Antony. But yeah, I don't know. It would depend. It would depend upon the nature of the deal, and also with a lot of screenwriting, you know, I'd probably try and negotiate a deal whereby I would be paid to write a first draft, and then I would fully expect to be fired off it immediately afterwards, as is not unknown in Hollywood. It has to be said, or television, frankly.
That is quite a common deal, isn't it? Yeah, it's like part of the option payment is you get to write the first draft, but they then also have the freedom to completely ignore it and hire somebody else to write another one.
Yes. It's when I was writing TV and I got fired off a job, and I was commiserating to one of my screenwriter friends. They said, "Oh, see, it's a rite of passage. You're a proper screenwriter now. You've been fired off something that you were writing." I was like, "Yeah, that doesn't happen in most of the other things I do. You're not waiting to get fired. You know, when you're writing comic, well, maybe if you're writing, I don't know, if you're writing Batman, there will come a time where the editor will change and they will say, not so much you anymore. Welcome to Dumpsville Population You." But if it's your own characters, you in comics, you're not going to get fired off your own characters. And the same with your own series of novels. You're not going to get fired off your own characters. If you're writing work for hire or somebody else's intellectual property, then yes, you can be replaced at a moment's notice. That's the nature of the beast.
For your current series that you're writing, do you have a kind of end point in mind? Like, how many books have you got out? Do you know where they're going to end?
Ooh.
No, I mean, I have a very, very, and I'm not going to tell anybody what it is. I have a very, very loose, book 3, book 4, book 5, book 6 might be the book that's about this kind of thing. But honestly, those things are about my main character's personal life, not plot things at all. Because one of the things I try to do in the Brigitte books is that she does develop as a character throughout the series. She's not the same in, this latest, in the 3rd book, as she is in the 1st book. She has changed and matured and aged and developed as a character. And so those little one-line notes that I've written are very much about her personal life and her family life, not plot things at all. Partly because the plots are all, it's very much focused on the modern day and modern technology. So it's impossible to predict what I might write a book about in 3 years' time, that's connected to modern technology, because, look at how quickly things change. So, I don't have an end point in mind, but it's not something I think about either.
Yeah, and also to a large extent, it's dependent upon sales and, continuing contracts and things flowing onwards from there. I mean, I'm contracted for book 3, which is coming out next summer, and book 4, which will be out in 2024, all things being equal. And then after that, it's sales will determine if there's further contracts. I mean, I suspect I will keep writing Cesarealdo regardless. And I've got a plan for beyond book 4, certainly. I'm doing the classic crime writer mistake of having him age in real time, but I have at least also gone for the Ben Aronovich approach, whereas that my character is considerably younger than me. So it doesn't matter. Once I get into my 60s, my character will still only be about 50 at that point. So I at least have sensibly not written a character who's older than me is going to age out very quickly.
Yeah, the second Bridge book is the sort of personal struggle that she's going through is her 30th birthday. That's a theme that runs throughout the whole book. And yeah, that was a long time ago for me.
You also tempted to go for a Ben Aronovich approach with your prose books of putting in something that's ridiculously expensive to film.
Well, I went for Renaissance Florence, and trust me, that is ridiculously expensive.
That's going to be pretty expensive, isn't it? Off to Prague again.
Yeah.
And I think most of mine would be anyway, because Bridge is forever hopping. She's Anglo-French, so she's forever hopping back and forth to France. And then there's also, in the second book, she goes to Estonia, and in the 3rd book, she goes actually I better not say, but there are lots of European countries covered. So unless they're all going to look like Prague, yes, it would probably be quite expensive.
Yes. Either that or they're going to spend a lot of money on green screen, and there's going to be a lot of people walking around in front of big green sheets, and then the special effects will do the rest of the heavy lifting.
Because Ben blew up Covent Garden, I think, didn't he, in one of his books?
Well, there's like a
That's in the very first one, isn't it?
The first one, there's like it's the Midnight Ride is the American title. There's a fire and a flood, and there's not much of Covent Garden left by the end of it. So it's like, yeah, okay. I can see why it's taken a while for that one to make it to the screen.
But I think that was almost deliberate, like of a choice to make something that would be really hard to film.
Possibly, because Ben has worked in TV and radio, hasn't he? So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me.
Yes, having written he was the first person to send a Dalek up a flight of stairs in Doctor Who. So.
Oh, was that Ben? I didn't know that.
Yes, yes, Remembrance.
I remember that episode.
Yes, and he wrote for Casualty, and he also wrote for Jupiter Moon, which is a series nobody remembers, and quite rightly.
So, when you're going into your books, obviously there's quite a lot of research if you're doing them in different European countries, you're setting them in Renaissance Florence. What's the most interesting kind of thing you've found when you've been researching for those books?
Mostly what I tend to find is my own mistakes, unfortunately. I discovered after having 2 novels published that a lot of churches in Renaissance Florence didn't have pews. You had to stand up when you went to church, which I did not realize. And so there's people sitting on pews in the first book, City of Vengeance, and now I'm like, ugh. Somebody pointed out to me they didn't have, or they had tomatoes, but they believed that tomatoes were poisonous, and so they just used them to decorate the dining room table, but they weren't eating tomatoes yet. Which, if you think about most Italian cuisine now, it's like the tomato is in, the vast majority of Italian. It's hard to imagine Italian food without the tomato in it. And yet they're not going to start eating tomatoes for another 5 books as far as I'm concerned. So that was slightly annoying to discover that, because there's tomatoes in book 1 as well. So it's the mistakes I find which drive me a little bit crazy. But you can't get everything accurate all the time with historical fiction.
Yeah, I mean, and the same with technology as well. I don't know if there's anything necessarily, extremely amusing or whatever about my research that I can relate. What I can say is that some of it is because it's all about modern technology. Sometimes it's frustrating in that in the first book, I made a deliberate decision not to talk too much about contemporary technology, because literally while I was writing the book, the video service Vine was launched, ran, and was then deleted, then ended, and was all while I was writing the book, for heaven's sake. Now, Vine wasn't something I was intending to feature in the book, but it really brought home to me the dangers of being a bit too cutting edge with your research. But then in the latest book, that's about sort of the rise of online radicalism and neo-fascists on social media and that sort of thing. And so I'm afraid there's nothing amusing there, other than to say that it was extremely depressing, actually. There was stuff that I found out during the research doing that book that I kind of wish I hadn't, and a lot of stuff that was really quite just thoroughly depressing and upsetting. But that's and I'm sure the same actually is probably true of Renaissance Italy. Some of because we have this romanticized view of the past and of the Renaissance era as being this great period of enlightenment, but a lot of people were still pretty horrible back then.
Yeah, no. One of the things that I discovered in research for the second book, Darkest Sin, is set in a convent. It's a locked room murder mystery set in a convent. So there was a lot of things I discovered about nuns that I couldn't put in that didn't suit the style or the tone of the book. And one of my favorites was the fact that there was always inside a convent, women had a lot of agency and power. They made collective decisions. They were able to set a lot of their own rules and restrictions on what they were and weren't going to do within the convent, although they still had conflict and argument inside. But it meant that the diocese and all the male clerics were constantly trying to exert authority over women inside the convent to limited or greater extent. And there's one fabulous story about these clerics all coming down the road to shut down this convent, to enclose it, to lock all the women inside for the rest of their lives. And so the nuns weren't having this, so they climbed onto the roof of the building and started hurling the terracotta roof tiles down at these, aged men in their purple, in their black surplices, and the clerics coming. So they drove them off. So the nuns, basically, it was like a riot at Strangeways, with these nuns hurling terracotta roof tiles at the Archbishop and the Monsignors. They all came to try and shut them down, which I would love to have put in the book, but tonally just didn't fit, sadly.
That's terrible, that, isn't it? When you go, I'd love to include that, but there's just no place for it.
I know, and you just have to go, oh, well, I'll talk about that when I have conversations like this instead.
Sam's asked if there's any genres you think are underrepresented in graphic novels.
Oh, loads.
I mean, I think you can find a graphic novel for a lot of things.
You can, but in terms of the numbers, I mean, one of the common complaints of a lot of writers, myself included, over the last 30 years is the over-representation of superheroes because of the origins of the American market and the dominance of the American market, especially in the Anglophone world. It's kind of absurd how many superhero comics there are compared to every other genre. You go to somewhere like France, the bande dessinée market over there, or to Japan with the manga market, and it's completely the other way around. There is every genre you can think of is represented in comics. I've done a lot in my career over the last 20 years to try and do a tiny little bit to redress that balance by writing things like spy thrillers and police procedurals. I wrote a sci-fi police procedural series, literally solving murder mysteries on a space station. I've written historical thrillers. I wrote a Western. I've written rom-coms, all manner of stuff that isn't superheroes, frankly, in genres that are in the book world are some of the best-selling genres around. But when you go to the graphic novels market, they're a tiny little proportion of sales. It's completely backwards. So yes, there aren't many that aren't represented at all. As you say, you can find graphic novels for just about everything, but in terms of the proportions, there are many genres that are underrepresented.
Yeah. And as Antony says, I mean, so if you go to Japan, there's a manga for almost everything. One of my favorites is Prince of Tennis, which is about people playing tennis in college. And it's like a 20-volume series of people playing tennis and sweating, because in manga there's a lot of exertion and sweating and extreme emotions happening. But of course, I mean, you have this weird thing in graphic novels whereby somehow superheroes became the mainstream and everything else became alternative comics, which is just perverse. It would be the equivalent of prose fiction if we said that, I don't know, cat detectives were the only kinds of was the mainstream of publishing and everything else was alternative fiction. But there are territories where certain genres are hugely popular. So the Western is big in Italy and almost nowhere else in the world as a comics form. And there are parts of that cross over into other places. They love spy comics in Scandinavia, particularly. They're very fond of the spy comics. So Modesty Blaze is still going strong in Scandinavia. It's been, aside from the newspaper strip, it's dead everywhere else in the world. The Phantom, the comic I write for, is the biggest selling comic in Australia and has been for 50 years. He sells more than X-Men or Spider-Man or Batman. Wow. And it's just because it's been published locally for 50 years. And so it's available a lot more cheaply than other comics that you might buy. But yeah, the joy of things like crowdfunding platforms have enabled a lot of creators to publish far more interesting work rather than just men in tights and capes hitting each other, which is fine. Who doesn't love a bit of latent homoeroticism with violence? But, there are other kinds of story available. And actually, it's worth pointing out, the best-selling graphic novel in the UK for the past year was Heartstopper, which is, queer romance for teenagers. It's got nothing to do with tights and capes.
Well, and in the US, actually, the whole reason that the New York Times no longer has a graphic novels bestseller list is because it got to the point where every month it was the same books, the same series, and the same authors, but they were not superhero books. Most of the list was dominated by Raina Telgemeier, who writes autobiographical graphic novels about her life as a young girl, and the Walking Dead comics, which that's another one. See, a lot of people watch the Walking Dead TV show, have no idea that it started as a comic book, but those comic books sold in incredible numbers, just almost inconceivable numbers, and for months on end, with whatever the latest Walking Dead collection was, would just dominate the New York Times bestseller charts. Not a superhero in sight.
So we've got a couple of minutes left for the people who are watching this who've absolutely loved listening to you two as I have. Give them a recommendation of what you would like them to go away and buy of yours to get started on their reading journey if they haven't already read
Got
it.
Well, I would say the first Cesare Aldo novel, which is called City of Vengeance, out now in paperback, ebook, and audiobook. That's the first in the series. Darker Sin is number 2. Number 3 will be out next year. But I would say start with the first one, which is each book in my series, although they're historical thrillers, they're also their own subgenre. So the book 1 is a conspiracy thriller. Book 2 is a locked room mystery. Book 3, which is out next summer, is it's a revenge vendetta. And book 4, which I'll be writing soon, is that. No, I'm not going to say what that is. Wait.
Same here. In the first book in the Brigitte Sharp series is called the Xphoria Code. That's like Euphoria, but with an X. The second book is the Tempest Project. The third book, this one, as I say, the Patrios Network. You can read them standalone. Like each book contains all that you need to know to read it. But if you're planning to read the series, then absolutely start with the first, because, as I said, Bridge does evolve as a character throughout them. And then I'll also say, if you're a crime reader looking for a graphic novel of mine, I did, as I say, a police procedural murder mystery series set on a space station called The Fuse, and there are 4 collections of that. Each collection contains one case, essentially. And yeah, that's available from Image Comics, an American publisher, but they do also sell through comic shops here in the UK and online.
Fabulous. And that takes us to the end of our time. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. It's been our pleasure.